I am John Hancock. I don't have my name on my slides, like you do. Um, this topic is, I think, our first non-technical topic of the day, and it's hyperfocus-driven development. So I didn't know that I had ADHD. And that's a quote from me just now. I knew that I had days where I reached the end of the day and hadn't done any work and didn't even know what I had done for the past 8 hours. And I knew that sometimes I could really get in the zone and spend hours, days, even weeks and build something great. I'd get angry with myself for not being able to wrangle my own focus and use it at will. And I also knew that I repeatedly received very positive performance reviews, even though I felt that I was not living up to my potential. And I would digitally hide, and sometimes physically hide, from my managers and other people out of an unfounded fear that they were upset with me. And these things didn't feel right, but I didn't know why. So attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder is poorly named. For one, people with ADHD do not have a deficit of attention. They have difficulty regulating their attention and an intolerance for boredom. Also, the hyperactivity is optional. Not everyone has that part. Some people are merely inattentive. So, names aside, there are a lot of differences that people with ADHD experience from neurotypical people. So a few key aspects that have a huge impact on software development are time blindness, working memory, the emotional trifecta of intuition, empathy, and rejection sensitivity, and then hyperfocus. So let's get into those a little bit. Oh no, I did that thing where I didn't advance slides. Okay, here we go. So time blindness. Time blindness is being unaware of the passage of time. This makes it really difficult for people with ADHD to estimate how much time they've spent on a task, to estimate how much time it will take them to do a task in the future. Story points on a ticket, tough stuff. And it can also cause events in the past to sort of blur together. And it contributes to that feeling of having spent the entire workday doing something, but not being able to remember what it was. So working memory for neurotypical people is a little like an LRU cache. New items come in, they get a hash, they get added to the cache, and eventually old items get invalidated when the cache fills up. But for people with ADHD, the cache has a really poor hash function. And what happens is that the new items come in and they immediately collide with whatever items are in the cache, and then both or one of the items will be invalidated, and you just can't be sure which. It's very unpredictable. The result is that I double shift an Android and then sit there staring, trying to remember the name of the class that I wanted to open. Sorry, Android Studio. Anyway, so the emotional bits here. People with ADHD also have some unique strengths. They're typically very intuitive and can make leaps and associations that many people miss. That's due in part to the impulsivity and the disinhibition that comes with ADHD. They also tend to be strongly empathetic, not always in the right way, though. They often feel the emotions of others as strongly as they feel their own. And there's some interesting cognitive science on that, but don't have time to get into the research. But people with ADHD have a great deal of practice at coming to conclusions from limited information. And this helps them quickly grok and apply complex ideas. And feeling the emotions of others can help them to be cautious and thoughtful with communication. And it can help them imagine the way that their users will feel about the software that they create. The third piece of that trifecta is not strictly a part of ADHD, but it's often comorbid with ADHD. That means they often occur together. And that's rejection sensitivity, dysphoria. So it's an outsized sense of rejection from both external and internal sources. A person with RSD can have a mostly positive interaction with one small negative spot and then leave feeling deflated and entirely focused on only the negative. And people with ADHD, especially undiagnosed ADHD, have a lifetime of rejection to draw from. And their brains form associations against their will, and they begin to expect rejection and failure. They believe all of the negative things that they've heard or thought about themselves. This can make it very difficult to receive feedback. They see through the compliment sandwich. They hear the compliment and then wait for the criticism, because that's the part that they're expecting. It can also interfere with their ability to give good feedback to others. The intense empathy makes them fear that feeling of rejection that the other person is going to feel. It's an interesting one. Jennifer Peterson describes rejection sensitivity like a sunburn. Even a light, playful slap on the back can be extremely painful when you have a sunburn. And then there's hyperfocus, and that's our main topic today. Hyperfocus is not like the everyday focus that most people have when they can walk into an office, sit down, and do some tedious task because it's their job. It's a rolling wave that carries the rider along. I now understand that those times when I could do a week's worth of work in a day, something in my brain had clicked, and hyperfocus drove me to pay close attention to the details and actually do work continuously. Most of the important accomplishments in my career were the result of intense hyperfocus. And on the days that I've done nothing, sometimes I've just had no focal point at all, and other times I've been hyperfocused on something unimportant, like social media, who knows. So hyperfocus might alternately be described as an inability to stop focusing. And that's problematic in its own. So how does hyperfocus work? How does it fit in with software development? First, there's a source. The most common positive sources are interest and novelty. A new library comes out, a challenging task with a visible outcome, a new job. The most common negative sources are annoyance and pressure. Tedious tasks annoy people with ADHD to no end, and sometimes they get so hyper-focused on finding a faster way to do that tedious task that they can easily spend weeks or days or weeks automating a task that takes seconds. And I'm sure we've kind of all done that. The stress of a deadline can also trigger hyperfocus, especially if the developer has been procrastinating. Then there's a deep dive. Sometimes there's a research phase where the person spends uncounted hours reading, watching videos, and writing experimental code. Then there's recursion. Diving into that first layer almost always reveals another layer underneath that has to be understood. So the process begins again, and the stack builds. Once the developer gets the problem down to that base state, the lowest level that they already understand, they work their way back off the stack until they've completed what they started with. Now, that's the ideal case. And then there's the reward. And the reward can be just having completed the task, but sharing the result with others or receiving praise are often even more exciting and rewarding. So this sounds fun, and like I said, I've I've been successful, I've had good performance reviews, why bother trying to change it? And the problem is that hyperfocus can hurt software development in a lot of ways too. So first, hyperfocus development turns developers into silos. They ignore communication, they end up with a great understanding of how something works, but feel completely overwhelmed with the idea of sharing that information. So it can lead to code that works for now, but that only one person understands. Then there's perfectionism. And I used to think that perfectionist meant someone who was excellent at finishing something down to the fine details. But the truth is that a perfectionist can't see when it's time to stop. No matter how good the result is, they tweak forever, sometimes ruining the finally finished, honed finish that they were working for. So perfectionism can also prevent someone from starting a task because they know they can't make it perfect. People with ADHD are often perfectionists because they remember their past failures very vividly, but are often optimistic that this will be the one, this will be the time that I prove that I'm good enough, I'm not a failure, I'm not lazy. And then there's burnout. Hyperfocus is exhausting. Aaron Brooks says that hyperfocus is like a superpower that when used leaves you physically and emotionally drained. And relying on hyperfocus for your daily work means living in a state of exhaustion. It can make a person feel like something is wrong and they need a break, but they don't really know why. Hyperfocus is also really taxing on work-life balance. I personally have made a good habit of leaving work at 4, but when I'm gripped by hyperfocus, I struggle to leave my desk. I feel immense pressure to keep working, to finish the task, even when there's no such pressure from my employer. Also, failure can be catastrophic for an individual. Rejection sensitivity can make a person feel extremely ashamed of the wasted time and effort. They can feel like they've not only let themselves down, but disappointed coworkers, managers, and loved ones. It can be enough to make a person give up entirely. And success isn't always better. Success brings rewards and praise, but it's like this, right? We spend our nights and weekends away from our families, and that's what we get praised for. So the developer with ADHD feels that their only value is when hyperfocus rules them. They feel pressured to keep performing at that level. So they work themselves to exhaustion for a little more praise. And then there's fizzling out. Remember that hyperfocus is not selective. It starts on its own, and it doesn't always last through the project. Hyperfocus can abruptly stop, leaving the developer with a huge mess of code that isn't ready to commit and no willpower to continue working on it. Resuming a task after hyperfocus has fizzled is extremely difficult. And the combination of lost interest and the fear of fizzling out again is just an unstoppable duo. And finally, and I saved this one till last, is procrastination. I'm really good at this one. If a developer has had their greatest successes while hyperfocused, they can tend to avoid working when they're not hyperfocused. They end up procrastinating for hyperfocus to come. Then when hyperfocus does come, they ignore other tasks. When I'm deeply hyperfocused, the thought of taking a break to do some code review just fills me with dread because I'm afraid that I'll never get the focus back. And then also, it's easy to hyperfocus on something else, something not important, and then ignore all of your work. So how do we manage hyperfocus? First, let's talk about the manager's perspective. So if you're managing a developer who has these hyperfocus states, first off, avoid stopping them. Try to ride the wave with them. Stopping is somewhere between painful and impossible. It's like stopping a Gradle task. You click the button in Android Studio and nothing happens. So try to harness it instead. The results can definitely be worth it. Communicating is extremely important, and having the right language, having the right language to describe hyperfocus will go a long way toward understanding one another. So I'm going to move ahead a little bit because we're short on time and get to tools for the developer themselves to use. So first is a Pomodoro technique. Using a timer, set a timer for 25 minutes, work, then take 5 minutes off, and really take a break. This lets you plan chunks of the day that are set aside for things like code review or other important tasks, and helps you have that break time to keep aware of your body's needs. Self-talk. So this one sounds a little goofy and can feel uncomfortable, but Stuart Smalley had it right, looking into the mirror and affirming, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me. Positive self-talk can help ease the effects of rejection sensitivity and help reduce procrastinating. Noticeable lists. So this one sounds obvious, but to a person with ADHD, the concept of organization can be novel. So people with ADHD struggle with list apps because they make the list, they get excited, and then they forget that the app exists. Pen and paper is often the best tool if you can use that. But whatever you choose, make sure that it's accessible at all times and that it gets in your way. It needs to induce friction in your routine for it to work. So invasive alarms. Because time blindness plays such a large role in hyperfocus, it's essential that you set alarms that are more than just the ding and a pop-up from your calendar notification. If something is important, you need an alarm that won't let you do the usual, oh right, meeting in 10 minutes, and then forget, and then join 20 minutes late. I use the clock app on my phone for this. Every morning I set an alarm for each time commitment I have that day, and I can snooze them, but I cannot dismiss an alarm, or it's my personal rule, until I'm doing the thing, until I'm dialing into the meeting. So let's talk about processes a little bit. So first and foremost, you need a routine. I think many ADHD folks just sort of muddle through life, not being aware that they need a routine. But you're much more likely to pause for a break if you actually do it every day at the same time. And your routine should include forcing functions. For example, I found that if I bring coffee to my desk, I'll sip on lukewarm coffee until noon and then forget to brush my teeth until after lunch. Working from home, by the way, not in the office. That would be something else. So my rule is I finish my coffee before I leave the breakfast table, or I pour it out. No coffee at the desk. And then I get my teeth brushed every day. It's great. So forcing functions must be high impedance. They need to get in your way and not allow you to accidentally skip them. And then externalize. With the limited working memory and the time blindness, the more you can move things outside yourself, the better. This can be journaling, calendar apps, reminder apps, a coach, an assistant, a friend. The key is that you need a place to put things you need to remember and contextual, external, active prompts. With time and date-based prompts, this is easy. Calendar is great. But with other context, location, or meeting a person and remembering to tell them something you needed to say, that's a lot tougher, and I haven't found a great tool for that. So if you have suggestions, let me hear it. The best tool I can think of is a coach or an assistant that is good at remembering those things. So retrospectives. If you've worked any kind of agile shop, you're familiar with this. Folks with ADHD can be poor self-observers, so it's important to look back and ask yourself, what went well, what could have gone better, and what could I do differently in the future? And you can do this every day, or at least every couple of weeks. It's also great to bring in your manager and peers because they can see stuff that you do not. Eat, sleep, and exercise. So this one, again, seems obvious, but it's really easy to ignore your body and eat food that does not nourish you. and take the elevator and the stairs, and okay, late nights and over rest. I think I have one more thing. But an ADHD brain is already working really hard to keep up, and refusing to meet its needs just isn't fair. And finally, my last process is forgive yourself. So this feels like an odd one to call a process, but forgiving yourself isn't something you can do once. We make new mistakes all the time, and we hold those mistakes up as examples of why we're doomed to fail. Past mistakes sometimes just won't stay forgiven. So just like cleaning the kitchen is a process you have to repeat. You have to make time to forgive yourself for your mistakes and work toward accepting that your mistakes don't define you and that they're not an indicator for your future. So I didn't know that I had ADHD. I came to the suspicion with the help of tweets from Haley Smith and Chloe Condon, two kind of icons in our industry. And I really only came to that discovery because they chose to be open and vulnerable. And if this talk resonates with you, your next step is to read up. Ned Hallowell's book, Driven to Distraction, is a great place to start. Then find both a therapist and a psychiatrist to talk to. The psychiatrist is the only one that can diagnose ADHD and begin treatment. And many symptoms of ADHD are treatable with medication. I take Adderall twice a day, and it's really helped me with more normal focus, though it does not improve time blindness or working memory. So those are things that we'll always have to find workarounds and coping mechanisms for. I'm not a doctor, nor am I a therapist. I cannot diagnose nor give advice on medications, but I'm happy to provide resources, people to follow, books and article recommendations. So please come and find me, reach out on Twitter. Let's be open and let's be vulnerable. Let's talk about this stuff. Thank you.